turning it today and tomorrow. I'm turning it tomorrow.
I mean, there's nothing we can do about it.
I wish I could
do
do the
complain to
internship, but I
EA for not
can't
looking at your
because my
resume.
schedule, actual academic 4-year plan discussed school. Yeah, I was gonna apply for, they had a media designer internship open.
I say still do it. I'm like literally pushing back all my assignments.
So I'm still gonna talk back to the workshop because I'm streaming it.
It's just questionable.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 7th programming workshop.
Yeah.
Our topic today is not ALML, but it is audio and animation. So, there is a project for you to clone if you want to do that. You can clone that at the end if you want. We're not really going to be doing any challenge or anything today. But yeah, the slides are up as well. Those are both in the programming channel. So, I'm asking, we can do the animator. And the animator is basically, well, this is the animation controller, but the animator is what you attach to the game object. So in our little sprite here, we can see that it has an animator. And an animator has a animation controller that you create down here. So the animator is just the thing that you attach to an object that you want to actually move with animations. And there's not a whole lot of interesting options here. You just give it an animator in most cases and you're done. The update mode is for if you want to do some more advanced like physical movements, stuff like that. Culling mode, that's almost never used. And you can look more up on like the use cases in the manual and the scripting reference if you so desire. But yeah, so basically this animation controller is a way to, it's basically a finite state machine. And so you basically have a state where it's basically the default, and it will go to this state when it wakes up. So for this animation controller, I have this as idle, and it has no motion. So if we go into the game, then nothing's going to happen. However, we also have some transitions to a different state. This different state is called circle. And we can see in the inspector that this animation has a motion, has a speed, and so on and so forth. I believe if we go here, then we can inspect that these have different transitions. And basically these transitions are ways to get from one state to another. And if you don't know, these states are basically just animations. So if you wanted to say have a character controller where they have a jump animation, a walk animation, and an idle animation, your idle would be your default, and then you'd have a transition to both the jump and the running animation. And then each of those states needs to transition to another state. So in our simple little state machine, we just have a transition from idle to circle, and then we also have a transition back. So this circle, when it's done animating, because we don't have it repeat or loop its animation, it's just going to take this first transition back, and it doesn't have any conditions. So by default, when that animation plays, it's just going to go back to idle. However, to actually get to this animation, we do have to have a condition for this transition. And we have this condition listed here. It's called doCircle, and that is defined right up here in the parameters. And I have this parameter as a trigger. So this trigger is basically just, it's not to be confused with the actual triggers for collision. This trigger is just basically something that you can say, okay, animator, whenever you can, transition to something else. So it's almost like a Boolean, but a Boolean that you can only set to true, and then it's set to false when something is acted on. So basically, when we, in our script, set this trigger, or just trigger it, then it's going to say, okay, so now I'm going to take this transition, which you can have take some amount of time or something, and then it's going to go into this circle and start playing the animation attached to it. And how you access those from the script is with the set trigger function. So you have to, like most components, you have to get your animator. And this animator is basically just, a lot of the things you actually do to your animation controller, you do through your animator. So you only really need to get your animator, and then you can do most of the things from there. So in our animator, we have our set trigger function, and we just give it the name of the parameter that we want to trigger. In this case, it's do circle. And this is case sensitive, you give it a string, so on and so forth. So if we look in our code, we can see that we have our animator, and we call it my controller. We set it on start to be the game object's animator. And if get button down jump, then set trigger do circle. So when that trigger is triggered, it's going to go from idle to this transition into circle. When that is done, we can go back to idle. And if we can see that in our game, if we hit circle, an animation's going to play. Oh, no. If we hit space, the animation's going to play. Does anyone have any questions so far? Okay. So, we have our little state machine animation controller. There are other parameters that you can create to do different things. So you can have an integer and be like, when the integer is like a specific number or greater than something, then do an animation. You can set bools, so like as long as this bool is true, then do this animation or whatever, and set float, and you can do other things with float. Trigger is probably the one you're going to be using most, because you really just kind of want to control when you transition to one animation, play that animation for a while, and then go back. So triggers and bools are very useful here, but the integers and floats are useful for more finite control. Like you can set the speed of an animation, or you can set the time it takes to transition between animations, and so on, all from a script. So we have our animated controller, but we need to know how to make actual animations. And this doesn't have much to do with like the programming side. We're just kind of going over it briefly, how these animations look. So you have to actually open the animation window from the window drop-down menu. And if we just go into animation, it's going to open up here. I'm going to put it on the bottom, because I like to put it on the bottom. And from here, you can select an animation that you created. So to create these animations, you just right-click, create animation. And you should probably organize this accordingly. So you should like have an animations folder, or maybe put it in the same folder as your player prefabs or something like that. But each of your animations that you're using are going to be an actual asset that you create. So when we have that animation selected, then it's going to be the thing that we're editing down here. And we can see the name of it. It's called circle. It's right there. So to actually kind of edit this animation, we have to select the game object that we want to be manipulating. And we can animate basically any property within this animator. You can even animate script variables. If we had public like values, like integers or something, you could animate those values within this animator. Typically, you want to do transform, so we already have position right here. We can also animate rotation and scale. And then when you do that, you can create new keyframes. And unfortunately, we don't have much time to explain the basics of animation and keyframes, but basically, you define different points with different values, and it'll interpolate between them. And that's kind of how that animation system works. You can also have animation events, which are really useful for like if you have, say, an attack animation that takes a little bit of wind up, and then right at like the middle of the animation when the animation hits, you want to call a function to do an attack or something. That's what these animation events are really useful for. So you can add an animation event and then select a function from the game object that it's attached to. Right now, I don't have any functions to give it, so I'm just kind of delete it. But that's there for when you're doing a little bit more complex behaviors with animations. Any other questions on animations and how those are used? Okay. So our next topic is audio. So audio is a really important part of games, and we're not going to really go over the details of how to implement audio in Unity. We're just going to be kind of going over how you control these things in scripts. So in our project, we have 2 audio sources, and audio sources are basically just, places that are going to be playing audio clips.
Can you create one in front of us?
Create audio source. There's one. It's now parented to that other audio source. So yeah, they're just game objects like everything else. You can add audio sources to existing game objects if you want. So say you have a rigid body and you just want that rigid body to have a audio source attached to it, so every time it hits something and it plays a sound, that's also perfectly fine. You just add the audio source component. That's the most important part. And this audio source has a lot of really cool, neat effects, and you can add mixers to it and have 3D sound settings. Really all we're interested in for this demo is that this is on the right and it's 3D audio. This is on the left, it's also 3D audio. And we have a audio listener that is attached to the camera. And that's basically the point of reference for the viewer or the listener. And that's going to determine how quiet things are in 3D space, where sounds are positioned, and so on and so forth. So that's basically your point of reference. So when this audio plays, it's going to be heavier in the right ear than it is in the left. And when this audio plays, it's going to be heavier in the left ear than it is on the right. So also we have these 2 properties, play on awake and loop. So for songs and stuff, you probably want to have play on awake enabled and loop enabled if you have a decent loop of your song. But for just general sound effects, like a gunshot or something, you probably want to have both of these off, because you want to spawn your audio source and then only play it from scripts. And yeah, audio listener. So when we want to play sound effects, we have to actually get these audio sources. So you can either get the component or get a game object that has one. And once you have that, you can play your sounds or manipulate anything about the audio source that you want. Usually you're just going to be playing sounds, and that's just the method.play. And you can, I believe this has optional parameters, arguments that you can give it for how long, how many times, and where in the clip to play. But yeah, that's basically how we do that. In our script, we just also do that. So if basically player hits the right button, or D, then our first audio source, play that, and then the same thing for the second audio source. We also want if you try to play a audio source while it's already playing, it's going to cut off and start over. there are different ways to deal with that, but typically you just want to say, if the audio is already playing, don't play anymore. If you wanted to spawn a new sound every time that you played something, then I think usually you spawn new audio sources every time from like an audio source prefab or something.
There is also other functions we can use.
Yeah, so there's also the play one shot. I believe you can use this to achieve that effect, right?
I don't know, because actually I'm more familiar with another function, but I believe that's a bad way, so I didn't put it there. There is another function called audio source dot play clip at point, and what that function do is that function take an audio clip and it will generate one audio source. Generate one something I forget, but it will generate a new object in the scene, and that will play sound, and you can have like you can use that function to generate multiple objects at the same time, and they will not conflict with each other.
Yeah, so that kind of thing is useful for if you want like a lot of audio sound effects playing at the same time. So like gun sound effects, maybe footsteps, so on and so forth. So this play one shot is something you can use to play different clips than the one assigned. You can, of course, just select a different clip and put it in from the script, but this is a little bit shorter, so you can actually have audio clip types, and then give that to the play one shot, and that's just going to play that once and then go back. And that's basically it. So we can kind of see how this works. So we have these two different plays. So if we hit the right button, the right audio source is going to play. Hit the left button, the left one's going to play. Go into our script, our game. You can do that. Nice sound. So, yeah, any questions on audio? How you would implement anything that you're thinking about, or so on?
Not currently.
Okay. So yeah, you can clone this and play around with this project, or just use it as like a reference for something you want to implement. But that's just about it for these systems. There's a lot more in-depth stuff that we could do with the actual animation side and the audio side, but that's more of stuff that your audio designers or so on would be interfacing with, and then from the scripts you just kind of play those. That makes sense. We also have at the end of the slideshow a reference, so if you are interested in actually like diving into these systems in Unity, we have the general animation reference, references for the animation controller, animation window, audio reference for like all things audio, audio clip, listener, and audio source. And then for the scripting reference, we have the animator, which is what you're going to be interfacing with, and audio source, which is the audio thing you're going to be interfacing with. And that's that's all for these workshops. This is the last workshop for this quarter. Thank y'all for attending. And next quarter, I'll be teaching Intro to Godot, which is a vastly superior engine. And Wynn will be teaching Scratch.
No, I will not.
Other officers are going to be teaching Unity and Unreal.